Thank you, Diane. And good morning, everybody. Say hello. Let's have a hello. I'm Jean. Good morning. I'm going to be co-facilitating this morning with my colleague, Georgia, who for me is there. So Georgia, just a big hello from Georgia. And just such a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for making this your priority this morning in amongst everything else you could be doing, which we realise is a huge amount of other work that you could have chosen to do this morning. So a very brief introduction from Georgia and myself before we get into the session. So Georgia and I met each other, it's 4 years ago, almost coming up, 4 years at the NHS Nightingale London training and education faculty that we were both part of. And following on from that work where we were essentially helping to prepare people for the work they were going to be doing, which was unknown at the time, we have developed a range of work together, supporting colleagues across health and social care and more broadly in public services, with essentially creating environments where we put human beings at the centre of our work. And of course, a trauma-informed approach has human beings at the centre, and we'll say more about that very shortly. My role here is to co-facilitate. I work as an independent person. I run a small consultancy that focuses on the quality of the way we work together at work, really builds the foundations for the quality of what we can provide for clients and for the public. So you might call that culture. I call it the way we interact together and the way that we work jointly. So Georgia, over to you, and I will in the meantime just sort out the slides up and will come back to me shortly. Georgia.
Thanks so much, Jean. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Georgia. I am actually a lecturer in occupational therapy at the moment. That's what I spend most of my time doing. And my background is actually as a mental health specialist. So what's really important to know, I suppose, is an occupational therapy. I don't know if we have any occupational therapists in the room, but we really look at sort of what the theory might be and then what that means for what we do in our everyday life. So what I'm going to be offering here in how I'm supporting Jean with what we're learning today is some of that theory around trauma and then just really applying it to the contexts that we work in. So if you're an occupational therapist, some of it will be a bit familiar, I'm sure. I'm really looking forward to getting into it with you all.
Yeah, and maybe if you are an OT, just put OT, yay, into the chat so we just have a sense of whether there is anybody from that perspective. So what we'd like to create as an environment this morning is an environment where we can learn together first and foremost. This is not about us sitting here talking all morning. It's about Georgia and I being here. Oh, we've got some OT yay coming into the chat. Wonderful. We want to create an environment where we can learn together, and you have huge expertise yourselves and wisdom in the room, and we would really like you to share that as well, because there are so many different ways and perspectives that are valuable in this area of understanding a trauma-informed approach. So please don't feel in any way that what we're saying is the only way of looking at it. It's the way that we have got to in our thinking and learning about this. But there are lots of other perspectives, so please do throw those in. And also let's be curious together, because every time we work with a group, Georgia and I learn new things and get new insights. So we hope that the environment will enable that. And so what we have as tools to help us along the way this morning are obviously some visuals to help guide you through, although we don't want to over rely on those. And also we're going to use a tool called Menti, which many of you may be familiar with. But first, before we share that with you, there's just a moment for you to kind of join psychologically into the session. Some of you have been on the school run, some of you have been walking the dog. Who knows what's been going on in the 2.5 hours for you since you woke up? And some of you might have been awake all night, who knows? And actually that's core to this. Who knows what's going on for any of us? It's really hard to know what is going on beyond all of this apparent professional veneer. Well, some of us look less professional than others, but that's kind of deliberate. So just a moment for you individually to consider, well, where am I right now? And this isn't about us, don't worry, we're not going to start asking you to talk about how you're feeling. In a group this size, that wouldn't really be very constructive. What we're just going to gently invite you into is to just take a look at this image, which might be familiar to some people. Ian Long does some amazing illustrations that are conversation starters. And just to consider, well, if I were to kind of put myself on this or point to where I feel right now, where would it be for you? That's the first kind of just moment for you to reflect. And you might even have been a few of these blob people already in the morning. It's not that you are only one of them. And if you are at all inclined, and there is absolutely no obligation or expectation around this, it's your choice. We invite you, if you wish, to use the Menti code here. You can put menti.com into your phone or into a window on your device and put that code in.
See ya.
Thank you. Or you can scan that QR code and it should take you straight to the image. And we're going to just put this up and see if there are any blobs that appear for us to have a look at, so that we can just start to respect and honour the emotion that is in the room in a safe way. So this is completely anonymous. There's no way we'll know who's put what. And it's up to you whether you want to do this or not. It's just something that we think can be potentially helpful, and it might be something for you to think about in your practice with colleagues, is to just pay attention more than anything else to how people are. So I'm going to share that, and as there's so many people in the group, there are quite a lot of blobs appearing. But let's just take a moment first to just observe and notice any patterns in that for ourselves. And of course, what this does, it starts to make visible what is otherwise potentially invisible to us in our work together as colleagues. But doing it this way is probably, it's just dipping a tiny toe into saying we're going to pay attention to how people feel. We're not going to do a big debrief. We're not going to ask people to say why they've put their blob where they are. But actually, that is open as a scope for you. If you were to use this with people, it could start those conversations if that were appropriate in the setting. If we had difficult decisions to make this morning, which I guess in a development session we probably don't, but if we were doing work that involves some difficult decisions, some maybe conversations we needed to have about uncomfortable issues, having just raised our awareness to the fact that in the session this morning, we've got some people feeling that they're sort of sitting with a bit of a chain around them, away from everybody else. We've got some people indicating that they're hanging on to the cliff edge. We've got some people who are really clinging on to that bridge over a chasm, as well as we've got some people who are feeling that they're like this, or that they've got, you know, their arms around somebody. There's a whole range, and it just starts to raise our consciousness to the emotional field, which is a term that sometimes is useful to think about, because those feelings and that reality for people is there whether we acknowledge it or not. And if we acknowledge it, it can just help us to treat each other, interact with each other with a consideration of that whole emotional spectrum. Okay, so Thank you for those of you who've offered and shared anonymously there. And just going to check in with Georgia before we move on, whether there's anything you would add, Georgia, at this stage around framing this.
Yeah, I think it's just, it's important to remember that when we turn up to work, it's just a summary of what you said really, Jeanne, but that although we're in our professional role and we put our professional face forward, all of these emotions are still there. And it's great, I think, to have an opportunity to tune into both ourselves and the room around us and just start. It's a really nice place to start when we're talking about trauma-informed practice, about having that awareness.
And I think just the other thing before we carry on is that the way Georgia and I work, we're human. And part of working in a trauma-informed approach is tapping into essentially connecting as human beings. And neither of us is perfect. Neither of us pretends to be. And we might have some cock-ups along the way this morning. Things might not go quite the way we expect. I might say something in a clumsy way and have to rewind and say, sorry, I'm going to do that again. Because actually we're going to be forgiving of ourselves for being human. And this is absolutely core to modelling an environment where people can feel that their whole selves is supported in the workplace. So I guess we're unapologetically going to now launch into maybe something that is helpful, and we want to share our wisdom, and also we might sort of stumble and trip along our way as well. So please do support us if that happens. So I'm going to now pass over to Georgia to take us through the first part of the morning, which is intended to help us gather a shared understanding or a shared perspective on what we're talking about when we refer to trauma-informed leadership. So to trauma, sorry. And this is really helpful because it just helps us to understand each other in what we're talking about. It doesn't mean that it's the right answer, but I'm going to hand over to Georgia to guide us through this with her absolute expertise.
Thanks, Jeanne. Yeah, so what we'll do now is we're going to establish a baseline that we're all working from with this term trauma that has been used so frequently, particularly over the past 4 years, and has been used in relation to health and social care and frontline workers, with these sort of assumptions that people are going to experience trauma as part of the nature of their work. But what does that word mean? And we're going to be talking about it from the perspective of trauma being a nervous system response in our bodies that is where the psychological meets the physiological. So we're going to be doing something quite concrete with trauma here. And when we say trauma as well, the thing I really want to establish now, and I will throughout, is that it's always unique to the individual. It's like a fingerprint. It might look common from a distance, but when you get up to it, it's always unique factors that have led to an individual experiencing something as a traumatic event. So if we go to the next slide, here's a Freudian definition for you. And there's a river there because I am going to be using the metaphor of the river throughout. I just think it's a lovely metaphor. So a Freudian definition would say that trauma is a breach in the protective barrier. So if we think of these riverbanks as the barrier that keep the water contained, it is a breach in that barrier against overstimulation. So people often talk about emotional stimulation as sort of feeling flooded. So if we think of an event that could cause a response in the body as being so significant that it floods the nervous system and breaches our protective barrier, that has a potential to have a traumatic effect. But the key thing here is that it results in an overwhelming sense of helplessness. So this is what we need to remember. The difference between distress versus a long-term traumatic response in the body is whether a person feels they can have autonomy and get themselves to safety and escape the traumatizing or distressing event. So a breach in the protective barrier against overstimulation, resulting in an overwhelming sense of helplessness. So we all sort of hear about things that could be traumatizing. We have sort of ideas about this, and I'll just briefly discuss the things that have potential to cause a traumatic response in the body for a person. There are single events that we would all consider It could be the loss of a parent. It could be an accident. It could be an assault. These are things that we would classically flag as potentially traumatizing. There's also more contextual factors. So the situation a person lives in, we've actually found that poverty can have a traumatizing factor. So an inability to escape the conditions of poverty. We found that extended exposure to a particular environment has potential to, over time, flood the system, have that overstimulation over time and erode that protective barrier of those riverbanks and lead to a traumatic response. And then there is a relational factors. So this is the way that we interact with one another has potential to cause a traumatic response for people. This could be short-term acute. It could also be something systemic. So for example, a teenager who goes to a half-term camp for a week might be bullied, but would potentially recover from that. But if they are bullied systemically over 3 years, this will lead to that overstimulation, erosion of those banks, and has potential to overwhelm the nervous system. And what's key to note as well, so when we're thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about our colleagues and people we know in the world. All forms of trauma can obviously occur at any age, but the impact is going to be different for a person depending on the age at which it's experienced. So all of our systems in our body are developing and responding to environment and responding to our social environment as we grow up as children. So, cardiovascular, the way our brain is built, the same is true for the nervous system that is responsible for emotional regulation and that has the potential to be traumatized. So our psychosomatic nervous system, our parasympathetic nervous system. So the best example I can think of this is the death of a parent as a child. Age, say, 3 years old is going to be very different to the experience of the death of a parent at 60 years old, although that could still have a traumatizing effect for the individual. And this is just to bear in mind, we can't know everything that's happened to a person. People have a long arc for their lives. And also, we don't need to know everything that's happened. We just need to hold this in mind because it helps facilitate our compassion and our generosity in the space that we give to people that we meet or people that we're working with, that we can't know their history entirely. I hope that makes sense. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Okay, and so this is an important question as well. What is the difference between distressing, as in I had a distressing experience that I felt upset about, versus traumatic, which is that an experience has affected me to such a degree that I cannot integrate the experience I had, and I keep to some degree reliving it, or it's interfering with the way I live my life day to day, or it's interrupting my relationships on my day-to-day function. Okay. So there are lots of different factors. And again, it's different for everyone. It's always unique to individual. But basically, we cannot assume that one event will or will not be traumatizing, okay? We're all at different places. We all have different levels of resilience or wear and tear. And it's really important to think about this when we're being generous and compassionate to the people that we're talking to or working with, and not making assumptions about what a person should or shouldn't be able to tolerate. So something to think about when we're thinking about other people's experience and our own experience is social factors. So in our macro culture, which is the culture of the country that we live in, potentially the continent that we live in, or it could even be the city. What the factor, there are different identity factors. Sorry, the screen's gone a little bit dark there. There we go, it's back. The identity aspects of our identity that we hold and that we live every day will alter our experience in the macro culture that we live in. So this is sort of race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, faith or religion, age, all sorts of factors that can be included in how we're received. And if the macro culture that we live in, it could either celebrate aspects of our identity, it could accept aspects of our identity, or tolerate. Now, we talk about tolerance a lot, but to feel tolerated is actually not a great feeling. Or it could be begrudged, or it could even be a lot of animosity towards aspects of our identity. If we think of this, the potential for things to flood those riverbanks or to kind of increase the stimulation of those riverbanks, day to day, if we're supported and welcomed, that's not going to add to the through flow of that stimulation. But if there are feelings of antagonism or unsafety that come from the fundamental aspects of who we are, that's going to be on a daily basis adding to that flow, to that level of stimulation. And so we need to think for different people, there could be aspects of wear and tear on those banks day to day that other people aren't necessarily experiencing. On a micro level, however, if we think of this as families, if we think of this as teams that we work in, we might have identity factors that are not celebrated, that make our life day to day more difficult. However, if we're in a supportive microculture that celebrates us, that acknowledges our worth, the things that we can do well, where we feel we have autonomy and we can do a good job, then that is incredibly protective. Okay, so if you might be in a very difficult job, but if you have a great team around you, that's going to be hugely protective. There's also personal history, which I touched on before. People might have had all sorts of experiences that have made them more or less vulnerable to increased stimulation and wear and tear on those banks and that breach. There's a biological predisposition to some degree. So people often think of autism as being more likely to lead to something being traumatizing. However, some neurodiversity actually kind of can be protective around that. A lot of people with ADHD respond really well to crisis. There's also the ability to escape the event. So just to reiterate this, in the event of something happening that is distressing and has potential to be traumatic, the key factor really is, does that person have a way to look after themselves and to feel that they can escape? There was an assumption that children proximate to the Twin Towers during 9/11, that they would all have experienced the event as traumatic. But when they were surveyed, actually children who had some faith in their caregivers or had been protected by their caregivers effectively during that event, they actually didn't experience it as an enduring trauma. They were distressed, but they were able to integrate the experience as a past memory and then move forward. And then a final, another thing to consider really is that sustained exposure to distressing circumstance or relationships. I use the example of somebody, of school age experiencing an extended period of years of bullying that can make a huge difference. There could also be, in aspects of like an abusive relationship potentially, or ongoing pressures. If we think of the COVID-19 pandemic, for different people, the sustained exposure could have been enough to flood that system. So we're thinking less about the individual event itself and what the cumulative wear and tear is that leads to a person feeling that they no longer have control and an event or experience breaching those banks. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to use the polyvagal theory. We're going to use some theory around polyvagal system to understand the physiology in the body. Because understanding the physiology really gives us something concrete to work with when we're thinking about how we moderate and hold ourselves through events and how we think about other people doing that as well. So I know that we're not all healthcare colleagues, so I'm just going to give a little refresher on the autonomic nervous system, or intro for those who have different training to myself. So the autonomic nervous system regulates our internal environment, and there are kind of essentially two, let's say that it is more complicated than this, but for the purposes of this teaching, we will talk about the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So sympathetic gets called fight or flight. I like to think of it as drive. So whenever we're engaged to do something, the sympathetic nervous system needs to be switched on. So when we're working, when we're going about our tasks day to day. The parasympathetic nervous system, which I tend to remember as being like a parachute, gently lowering us down to the ground, is engaged for us to rest and to digest food. So if we look at the different roles of these aspects of the nervous system, and it's important to remember, when one is engaged, the other can't really be engaged. Okay, so it's kind of they can to some degree, but they don't really work well unless it's one or the other. And the sympathetic nervous system, when it activates, our heart rate will go up, our respiration rate will go up, we will be prepared for fight or flight or do. And because of this, energy will be diverted away from our digestive system and into making sure all our cells have enough blood, that we're ready for action, the blood and oxygen. And it will override our parasympathetic nervous system as an old survival mechanism. You know, if you need to get up and go and keep yourself safe, our body needs to be able to activate that primarily, so it can be favored. The parasympathetic nervous system, however, actually applies a brake to the heart rate. And when I learned about this, I thought this was really interesting, because we think of ourselves as falling into a place of rest. We think of ourselves as defaulting there. But what this tells us is that actually we have to engage rest. It's a state that we move into proactively. And when we sort of offer people mindfulness practice and things like that, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to put that brake on and work out how to learn to engage with it consciously. And we have to have this part of our nervous system engaged in order to effectively digest food, to be able to sleep properly, to rest and recover and have cell renewal. And it just can't engage properly if the sympathetic nervous system is engaged. So thinking about anxiety and like we don't have an appetite, or thoughts are racing and we can't sleep properly, it's because this parasympathetic nervous system isn't getting a chance to clock in and take the wheel for a little bit and help us rest. And we're being led by our sympathetic nervous system. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So with this in mind, the polyvagal theory actually breaks this down into 3 nervous system states that are related. So I'll start on the right-hand side. So maybe I should start. So this is the order through which we move through these different states. We go from connect to fight or flight to freeze. So we just talked about drive. So let's talk about that now. It's the most commonly known nervous system response. We all know about fight or flight, but do we know about freeze? And do we know about connect, as Deb Dana named it? So in freeze, what is happening is that we have been not able to resolve whatever has caused the whatever has stimulated us into this fight or flight or do or drive nervous system state. And this is where things have just sort of piled on top. We can't find a solution right now. And so freeze is it's a disengagement. At its most extreme, it looks like dissociation. At its least extreme, it looks like zoning out. It's a necessary state. And in freeze, we have a higher pain threshold, we have a lower use of energy, and it just puts us slightly outside of things until we can like gather ourselves to come back and resolve whatever issue put us into drive. And then we also have, so freeze is rarely talked about, and even less talked about is the state of connect. So this is the state we're at when we're not zoned out in order to preserve energy, we are actually relaxed. This is when we're able to rest, to digest our food well, and it's called connect because we not only connect with other people more effectively in this state, but we're able to connect with ourselves more effectively. And this is really important to realize really how important that self-connection is. When we think about burnout, one of the key issues there is a lack of connection with our role, and that comes through a lack of connection with ourselves and our values potentially. And what's also good to know about this state when we're thinking about working actively with the body and the nervous system is that the easiest way to get into connect is to connect to someone else who feels calm and grounded, to attune ourselves. And that's very much, you know, the thing about trauma is it's inherently relational. Both often the cause can be relational, but almost always the solution is also relational, and it's how we work with each other. So there's loads of potential to heal with each other. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Just want to restate, none of these nervous system states are wrong. You know, we hear this from mindfulness practice. We don't cling to anything or push anything away. We just accept things as they are. They're all necessary. They all have their use at different times, and the problems just occur when any of them are activated too much or too little. So that's really important. It's this dysregulation. It's this, that when those banks are breached and we lose control of how much we move through these different states and how long we stay in them. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So here's a little, I try my best. I'm not really an IT kind of person, but here's a little attempt at a diagram there. So thinking about a connect is where we ideally want to sit. It's where we want to be returning to, and yeah, a place that we spend as much time as we can for ourselves and for others. And I'll use the example of a ward just because it's one that's really common to me, but please run this through your own filter of experience for your own learning. So if we imagine a situation where we come onto a ward and we're in Connect, we're rested, we had a good break, and we come onto the ward and we're feeling okay. Something occurs, there's an incident with a patient on the ward, and we go up to drive. We need to deal with this. Now, if we manage to deal with this incident well, and then we resolve it, and then we return to a team that we feel supported by, we come back, we connect with the team, we connect with ourselves, and we're able to move forward. However, if we go up into this drive state and we cannot resolve it, things are escalating. It might be that a colleague comes and does a change of face with us and we go and take a break for 15, 20 minutes. But because we haven't resolved the issue, we don't go back to connect. We come up to freeze. We go and zone out for a bit. Look at your phone, look at a magazine, maybe try and drink a cup of tea or something in the break room. And then after a little break, we re-engage with drive, and then we hopefully resolve it. And then we're able to truly resolve it and come back to connect. However, unfortunately, we've all been here to a degree. We've seen this for our colleagues or for ourselves or for patients as well. We're in that freeze state. We can't resolve it again. And then what happens is we might take ourselves to the point of freeze. And if we cannot resolve the issue and we feel unsafe, perhaps other things have happened in recent times that means that we were already quite close to our limit anyway. There is potential that if we cannot feel safe and like we can resolve things, that bank might be breached. And we could get to a point where this incident becomes experienced as an enduring trauma. Okay, so that's just a work-based experience of how we could get to that state potentially. The good news is these banks can be rebuilt. We can intentionally do the things that we need to do through activities and really practical exercises to help build those banks back up and learn to re-regulate again. Okay, we'll talk about that later in the session. So here's just some snippets of what it might look like if we're looking out for ourselves and others. So dissociation is the most extreme version of freeze. If somebody has experienced an event so severe that their body and mind really don't believe there's another way to stay safe other than jumping into a dissociated state and just removing ourselves from reality. It can be described as going offline. The most severe case I worked with was somebody who would lose hours and she might end up on a different side of town. But it can be as simple as just having not a great memory or just zoning out a lot, or if somebody you could maybe hear it in someone's tone of voice, they're not quite in the room. And that's an overactive freeze state, okay? So if we're in a state too much, too little, that's an overactive freeze state. You might see panic or anxiety attacks. So panic being acute, shortness of breath, tearful, feeling like you're going to die, needing to lie down on the floor or have aids to breathing, such as a bag or something like that. And anxiety attacks are extended, so they could last for a few weeks. And especially when I was working with students, I would often see that people would not eat really at all for kind of 2 or 3 days and then suddenly binge eat a lot of sweets and salty, fatty foods because the parasympathetic nervous system isn't getting a look in and it's an overactive fight or flight response. And then the body will suddenly tell the person, like, we need to eat something and we need the essentials, sugar, fat, salt. And so that binge eating on that cycle would tell me this person's living in a heightened state of anxiety and an overactive drive state. You might see hypervigilance. So this could look like a few things. It might be thinking that people are following you, or might think that doors banging as somebody isn't somehow related to you. It could also look like inferring that someone is trying to attack you in what they're saying. So it could lead to fractious interpersonal relationships or believing that people don't have your best interests at heart, depending on what the origin of the experience was for someone. And then I'm just putting flashbacks in here briefly because they're the most known version of trauma when we talk about big T, like PTSD trauma. So for example, a soldier who's been in war returns to civilian life, there's a stimulus in the environment, something like fireworks, and it makes that person relive the memory through their body as if it's happening right now. And this can sometimes be mistaken for psychosis because in that moment, the individual they're living a reality for them that is not shared with people around them. And it does feel like a reality for that person. But the difference is that a flashback, people will generally come to know they're having a flashback and they'll find mechanisms to come back into shared reality, which is normally connecting with other people. And it's important to note actually as well, if it's been a relational trauma, so it's been something about dynamics with people, flashbacks will not look like this big obvious event. There'll be more of what's called an emotional flashback, which will be a flooding of a feeling that is associated with a past event linked to a current event. So someone might be full of like shame or fear or anger that's not directly related to what's happening in the now, but it's very hard to identify where it does belong. So this again can really interfere with relationships. Okay, so let's just have a sense of what you might be looking out for.
Yeah.
Go to the next.
And it may now be useful just to pause and consider, Georgia, we thought, didn't we, how actually trauma might be exacerbated by my work or in the workplace. So I think we thought it might be useful at this point to just take stock together on the very rich and wide-ranging overview there that George has given us with 2 or 3 questions. Now, obviously, you might want to put things into the chat, and also we're going to share back the Menti in case any of you want to anonymously share questions or points at this point, because in the chat it's not so easy to do that. So I guess, you know, we're interested in just having a chance to consider how might trauma be exacerbated through experiences at work, and are there any specific examples any of you would like to raise or mention at this point? Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak into the group here or ask. And there is also a question in the chat about menopause, which is, thank you, Tracy. I think I know Tracy, and I know that we're maybe of a similar generation, let's put it that way. So really pertinent for many people, and very much topical at the moment as well. So thank you for that question. Please, can you read? So just the Menti link, Nick, should be displayed at the top of the screen right now. Can you see that? Louise has also just put it back into the chat as well. So the great metaphor of the river, we'll share that again. I'll copy and put it into the chat there, Joe. Thank you for the prompt. Well, I'll do that in a minute. Okay, so just having a look at some of these comments, Georgia.
I think, yeah, it's clear that this is, everybody's really definitely understood how this applies in day-to-day life. It's things like not being listened to or acknowledged. So a response to something, if we look at that top left corner, a trigger event or a behavior that's seen, felt, or witnessed. So something could occur in the workplace that reminds you of a past event, and that definitely happens a lot, actually. A lot of people I work with, their trauma is suddenly evoked by the workplace. But belittling by management, so interpersonal issues, feelings of not being supported, and increased pressure, and a constant high pressure environment with not enough staff. So even just the context of the structural issues of how things are being managed can be a factor. And lack of time within role to look after own and others' well-being. So that wear and tear, that inability to recalibrate. There's lots on so negative feedback and pressure, psychologically unsafe situations that are unrelated to the source of trauma. So that's, it's really useful to remember that the thing that happens in the workplace may have like nothing at all to do with the original trauma. And I think because trauma is so it's so visceral, when we experience it, we can associate all of those frightened feelings with the thing that's happening right here and now. And it's important to try and pull those two things apart and sort of make sure that we're getting some sort of boundaries and clarity between those things if we're going to work effectively. And we have thinking of racism in an NHS setting on the wards with patients being racist and how colleagues respond. So that's really interesting. There's 2 aspects there. There is the wear and tear of how patients behave and interact, and the fact that as professionals we are compelled to provide care regardless of how a person behaves, which can be very challenging. So there's that wear and tear, but then there's also how is an individual supported in terms of their well-being, in terms of living with that experience every day, and the difference that people are going to have in terms of the exhaustion and the wear and tear and feeling unsafe, but having to deal with it as a professional. And I think this really links to what we were saying at the beginning with the blob bridge, which is we're all in different places, and although we're professional, we turn up as a whole human with all of our emotions every day. So we need to have that in mind in how we think about our colleagues and support our colleagues. And there's one here, a culture that jars with your values. So this idea of moral injury, sort of having to provide care or work in a way that actually causes us an aspect of moral injury in terms of how we're able to enact and live our values. And I do think that's something that we really struggle with a lot with cuts and things like that, isn't it? You know, we can't offer what we wanted to offer, or perhaps we're not able to work with colleagues who have the same sense of values underpinning their approach. Oh, and here's a really useful one that I think will be useful for later, Jeanne. Ongoing cultural issues, making it hard to admit where trauma has occurred. So it's just a couple down. Just thinking about that ability to just say what's happening and be honest and admit that you're struggling and have those vulnerable human conversations with each other that help you to actually get to the root of what's happening and feel like real, not solutions, because we're not looking to just fix everything, but like there's a real acknowledgement of the real context of what's happening, and we can be seen as who we are. So I don't know, do you want to speak to any of these, Jeanne? And there's so much useful stuff here. I really, really appreciate everybody putting these in, because it just shows how ready we are to start talking about this and using this approach in how we work.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, with your core sentence, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, I think that is such a powerful sentence, almost to kind of distinguish this from things that just feel difficult. And there is a bit of a theme, I think, through a lot of these in relation to that sense of overwhelming helplessness. Whether the helplessness is about trying to and wanting to help other people and not feeling you can, or helplessness around feeling a lack of power, agency, a lack of your own needs as a human being acknowledged and met, can help lead you to feel that you can't help yourself. So we will explore this as we go further through the session in relation to what we might call leadership and interactions with colleagues. And I think the cultural issues are also coming through, aren't they, Georgia? Which is where the second part of the session tends to focus, which is this thing we call culture, and actually how that develops, and the contribution that we each potentially make to that, knowingly or unknowingly. So I'm just going to scroll gradually down these so that everybody has a chance to see each other's contributions, but we obviously haven't got time to speak to every single one of them. If there's a blind spot where we've absolutely missed something that hasn't been mentioned so far, then please do feel free to speak out.
I will say there's one there that I think is really interesting, because one of my tutees has just been, I teach on an apprenticeship. So I work with people who are they're in work and managed, and micromanagement was there. And that control, that nitpicking, that feeling of not being trusted, that is actually a really significant one in terms of exacerbating existing traumas. So we really need to be aware of that.
Yeah. So just quietly absorbing these. Yeah. And I think, again, a theme we'll come to is from another perspective, looking at these are all actually natural human responses when human beings are under threat or feel a sense of their identity, their value, their integrity being threatened. This is classic signs. This is the way humans behave in groups and teams when they're under pressure, when they're under threat. And we give it all sorts of labels, but it happens in all groups. It happens in families, it happens in friendship groups, it happens in social networks as well as at work. However, the political, the power structures within our workplaces, and the pressure of what we're required and contracted to do adds to the sense of overwhelm for many people. Is there anything we could pick up around the menopause question, Georgia, before we forget it? Not to divert away from what's here, but
It's something that I've been in some discussions around it. I haven't looked at sort of menopause is a complex
Evidence-based,
thing
yeah.
that we've only just started talking about regulating the workplace, and there's aspects of it that I think get confused for mental health symptoms sometimes that are actually sort of part of the experience, around like brain fog or insomnia, or distractibility, that also come with some of the things of a body
Yeah.
feeling like it's under stress, which is, you know, changes in temperature and things like that. I would say that like any additional burden on our nervous system and our coping can make us somewhat more vulnerable to something being experienced as distressing enough to interact with it in a traumatic way. So I think we do need to be thinking about, you know, the way that we would think about neurodiversity as an aspect that requires some accommodation, and the way that we would think about you know, various issues around health and it does need to be factored in more. I don't maybe
I would add, sorry, Georgia, on the
Mm.
menopause side, only speaking from personal experience.
Sure.
One of the things is when your body starts doing things physiologically that you've never had it do before. And some people in the room might kind of relate to that. And I laugh because it's one of my ways of coping with the ridiculousness of menopause. I think it's just a ridiculous phenomenon. Why nature does it to us, I have no idea. Anyway, that's a different matter. Makes no adaptive sense in terms, you know, anyway. But actually that is when you've been a woman who you know, as maybe you felt that you've got your own agency and you make your own decisions, and then your body starts saying, oh no, actually you've got no control over me, and I'm going to do loads of things I've never done before, and it's my body, and I'm thinking that can really lead to a sense of helplessness because I can't control it. So I don't mean to jest and make light of things that are really, you know, debilitating for people, but actually we're all discovering about this because it's now less taboo. So I don't know if that sort of resonates with anybody.
I think there's I do know, like, I've had colleagues who have pushed for different types of leave and accommodations to be like, listen, I'm going through this and it's a huge change and I need support with that. And maybe there's something there as well in like how a workplace does or doesn't acknowledge like you're a valued member of staff, despite the fact that you may have had no sleep and things are very disrupted right now. And yeah, I think there's a lot.
Well, you're out of the UK this week, Georgia, but there's been legislative developments in that respect this week,
Brilliant.
which we're not here to talk about now, but legally workplaces are going to be required to make reasonable adjustments. Yeah, so well, yeah, it's an interesting debate going on. So yes, there's a couple of questions. There's a question from Grace in the chat, and I think Julie's got her hand up, Georgia, as well. So I don't know if you could have a quick look at Grace's point in the chat there, and let's just hear in from Julie. Julie, hi there. I think I saw Julie's hand up. Or what am I saying? Am I mistaking? Am I making a mistake?
I think it went back down again, Jean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Julie, if you wanted to come on in on this conversation, please do feel free. It might be that we've moved through what you were going to say. But yeah, there's something from Grace there.
This is one of my, I won't say favorite topics because obviously it's dire. But yes, climate anxiety. So my mum's actually a counsellor, and she's been I've seen through her like her publications and things that she's been in that this is a huge topic of conversation right now for talk therapists around the amount of eco-anxiety that is coming up. It's something that I've worked with a lot personally, as well as talking to others about it. And yeah, we live in a global context of a significant loss of autonomy, and some quite frightening up and coming events. And it depends how much you've looked at the data. I unfortunately have looked at it in great depth. And I would say it took me about a year of working through that to come to a place of feeling somewhat like I digested it. But I think when we're working with people, and especially we know this in mental health contexts, people who have severe and enduring mental health needs or anxiety, that this is one of the factors that's affecting people as well. So yeah, it's very real, it's very present, and unfortunately, it is an instance where we have some things we can do, but the things that we can't do are pretty significant. So yeah, I think it's really important to note these global contexts that we're in.
And thank you, Louise, for your comment into the chat there, which is, I feel, an acknowledgement of what people have shared here. There are a lot of experiences there that people have put into the Menti, and it's a really generous thing to do, I think, because seeing other people's experiences and insights and questions and concerns can, in a strange kind of way, help us feel a little less alone, if that is at all how we're feeling. And also, by being in this session this morning, I hope that it is providing a degree of support. And also, Louise, really value what you've said around hoping that people can find support for themselves as well. We are towards the end of the session going to offer a more practical tool to help people take care of themselves. We'll come back to that, and Georgia will guide us through that people can take away as well. But just wanted to acknowledge what you've put there, and thank you for it. So just a chance before we move on after the break, which is coming up shortly, we're going to slightly change focus, and but before we do, it's just a chance to kind of capture for yourself, okay, what have I kind of now understood that an hour ago maybe I didn't have quite the same insight into, because that can help just embed our insights and learning. So again, I'm just going to quietly scroll through this so that you have sight of what you've shared with each other.
I think I'd just like to say as well, in terms of people looking after themselves and a sense of containment and some sense of autonomy, is that having some experiences of trauma is part of life. It's part of the tapestry of who we are. It's a defense mechanism that helps us remember a significant danger to try and avoid it again in future. So I think we'll talk about this a bit later on, about making friends with the information that tells us we're struggling and we're stressed. Okay, so it's not that big frightening word. It's just something that's part of life.
So I'm going to come back to this slide in a minute, and also just before we break, checking, is there anything anybody would like to ask at this point, or raise, or put in another perspective on before we've got 5 minutes or so before we have a break?
Somebody just said in the chat they'd like the definition of trauma again. Is that the slide or verbal description?
I can put both into. I can put the slide into the chat. That I'll need to do that, and the other one about the river once I'm not sharing anymore, because I don't. It's it might be me, but my computer can't actually do that level of multitasking while I'm sharing my screen.
I find that
I will do, Joe. So we'll put the definition in again, and we'll put the river metaphor in.
Just to say as well, it's
and
basically,
we'll share the slides as well.
And it's
Georgia,
that's all right. It's where the psychological, so our emotional and our cognitive experience interacts with the physiological, so our nervous system and our body. So it's where those two things come together, and that experience overloads the nervous system and it struggles to regulate itself. Trauma from the Greek, I think, for wound. Don't quote me on that, could be Latin. I'm not a languages person.
Okay. Just have a look if there's any questions coming in through this channel. Yep, our email address will be on the last slide. So we can put that into the chat, but yeah, and you can by all means get in touch. Our HR processes for absence don't deal with trauma well. Do you offer advice around adjustments? Occupational health, not normally great at advice or offering the best interventions. So I think that it's becoming evident, more and more evident to me. Oh, sorry. I'll come back to Julie's point in a minute because Julie's responded in the chat there. It's become more and more evident to me in the last few years that HR processes with the best of intentions, and this is let's say this is a personal viewpoint because it's quite a strong maybe assertion, are not designed with care and compassion as their prime design principle. HR, human resources, and I was a qualified human resource professional, probably still am, but I don't kind of see that as part of my identity anymore, partly because the principles of it are largely around the organisation's needs and benefits rather than human beings. And obviously fairness and equity are important around things like absence and sickness and so on, and yet unfortunately it ends up feeling like a very bureaucratic, technical, procedural experience rather than a human-centred one. And I'm not sure how tenable a lot of that is for much longer, really, given the way society's going, but that's just a personal viewpoint. In terms of advice, I think, do you know, I think there's something to be said for just being person-centered, and equality isn't about doing the same for everybody. It's about offering everybody the same opportunities that are right for them. So I think that balancing procedural stuff with a human-centered approach would be potentially a nice balance to take in looking at adjustments. So I know that's not particularly detailed as an answer. However, I guess it's a perspective to take on it. Just other questions here. How do we appreciate trauma as a subject with our peers? I'm just going to put this back up because there are some questions coming in. So how do we appreciate trauma with peers and teams? I wonder whether this is about how we have conversations about it. Is maybe, Georgia, is that something you could just say a couple of things about? I'm just going to put the questions back up so you can see them. Here we go. So this point up here. Oh, just take your mic off.
Yeah, okay. So how do we appreciate trauma as a subject with our peers or teams? So I think it's an interesting one because I really want to iterate. I don't think we need to know what a person's trauma is to be sensitive to how it can show up in the workplace. I don't think we need to ask people to. So I think that's important if we're talking about it with others. I think there's something in being sensitive to the signs of it. If you see someone zone out and sort of go a bit sort of dazed, they're probably having a somewhat traumatized response to something that's happened. If somebody becomes very irritable and out of character, I would really want to emphasize some generosity to think this person's under a lot of pressure. And we do have this tool that we're going to share at the end of the session that could be used as like reflective practice within teams as well. But I think it's sort of about fostering a culture and maybe role modeling what you might learn here around ways of being compassionate or generous, if we're just going to appreciate the potential of trauma within our teams. So I think, yeah, maybe it's the word appreciate that feels Like there's a lot that could be interpreted through that word of like, are we allowing for it? Are we accommodating it? Are we asking to know about it? Are we wanting to share training with our team to get everybody on the same page? But I think it really comes down to fostering quality of relationships between each other and acting with curiosity about why people are doing things and generosity about where people might be coming from, without having to dig into, like, you know, what's happened to you and why you like this sort of thing. Does that make sense? As somebody who's worked with people with very severe trauma, I am incredibly cautious about asking people to disclose to me, because I don't always have the tools or time or containment to safely hold that for them. And what can happen if we ask about it is that it all spills out and it's sort of a bit of a Pandora's box. And if we're not in a position to hold that effectively, it's actually better to help a person learn to stay contained and feel heard and supported whilst they await talking to somebody who is in a position to do that professionally. So the key thing with trauma is really about containment. It's about safe boundaries, and it's about just creating environments where sort of people can rely on a consistency to know how that they're going to respond to each other. And I think we'll talk a bit about boundaries later on, but I think that's what's so important if we're going to be mindful of how we deal with trauma. Think of those banks of the river being breached and everything sort of flooding and being uncontained, and then the nervous system being dysregulated and uncontained. The best thing that we can do is offer our clear boundaries as workers so that we're at least contained. People come to work and they know what to expect. People come to work and they know when their hours finish. People know what they can ask a manager for and what they can't ask a manager for. And if we can have that steadiness and consistency in our working relationships and methods and structures and practice, we're providing an area of stability for somebody who's struggling with internal stability. So I think that's really the most practical thing we can do.
And it's such a balance, and we'll explore this balance after the break, because it really is a both and. It's making trauma discussable and not off limits, whilst not opening up conversations that people don't have time or scope to properly support people with. I think there is a real problem in given that balance. Often I see leaders and managers and colleagues defaulting to not discussing it at all. It's safer just not to go there. And actually that doesn't help either, because having things that are not discussable leaves gaps for assumptions and misunderstandings, which then can cause all sorts of problems in teams and groups and you know, groups of colleagues. And there's evidence to show that acknowledging emotion is fundamental, particularly acknowledging uncomfortable emotion, builds trust. However, acknowledging an uncomfortable emotion that it exists doesn't mean unpacking it all and dealing with it all. It's just acknowledging that there are uncomfortable emotions as part of our everyday work, and making it okay to express that I might be feeling angry, frustrated, overwhelmed, that's not a problem. It's not inadequate. It's not weak. It's part of the human condition. So it's really this balance that we're going to explore as we come back. And I've not forgotten the question about psychological safety in the Menti there, around how I think it's around how are organisations held to account when the culture isn't psychologically safe. And the answer there is multifaceted, I guess. Organisations are being held to account for that at the moment, from what I'm seeing, by people leaving. Because actually it's not part of the regulatory formalised accountability framework of governance and regulation, even though there are nods to culture being part of our inspection regimes. When we have inspectorates who themselves are modelling completely unsafe psychological spaces, we really have got some work to do. However, you know, and what do we mean anyway by accountability, which is another conversation. You know, what would it be to be held to hold an organisation to account for that? So there's quite a lot of complexity in that question, and I think that's overwhelming. And so what we want to do after the break is to really say, well, what can I do about any of this? Because it can feel as if we're just waiting for the system to do something. And of course, if we wait for the system to do something, nothing will change, because we're all waiting for someone else to change it. So that's where we'd like to go next. And so our focus now is going to turn to thinking about this in terms of what we might call leadership. And the reason I say leadership is that this is relevant, whatever your role. I believe that everybody has the potential to be a leader, regardless of their job title. And so really, when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about interacting with other people. To some extent, you could argue. And it can be helpful to look at our experience at work as essentially a human experience. An organisation, a department, essentially, what is it? It's a collection of human beings coming together to try and do some good work together. And so looking at this through the lens of what you might call like social science, behavioural science, it's really about how do human beings behave in groups together, typically. It's not always the same, but you know what? There's some really predictable patterns of how human beings behave, particularly when they're under pressure. And we haven't got time this morning to explore all aspects of that. But what we're going to share with you is some particular patterns of behaviour that you might recognise that I think shine a light on what can I do as a colleague or as a manager, as a leader, if I am taking a trauma-informed approach. Because trauma, for all the reasons Georgia has explored and all the reasons that you've also shared and thought through and considered so far in the session, trauma is essentially a threat. It's a response to a sense of threat, of helplessness. That is a threatening thing. And as human beings, because of our intrinsic survival instinct, we have ways of responding to threat. Now, there are lots of other threats in the workplace. And if you talk to colleagues at work about what they find threatening or unsafe, there are some really cool themes that come out. So how do human beings respond when they're under threat of some sort? Well, the pattern that I'm going to take you through here, and you might want to write these 4 letters down. Can you see those letters, Georgia, on the screen? Are they okay? Are what I call the BDSP. Self-protect, being driven to self-protect. B, being driven, D, self, S, protect. And what I'm going to take you through is a way of thinking. This is a way of remembering what is quite a complex set of dynamics. So what is BDSP? And once we know what BDSP is, how can we use that to help our interactions with a particular lens around trauma? So if you're writing down BDSP, the B is for blame. One of the most instinctive responses that is self-protecting when something happens that's uncomfortable, particularly when someone else does or says something that we don't, that threatens our own sense of self, our own sense of value, our ego, our sensitivities, our need to belong. A human response to that is, it's them, it's her, it's him. Just put a Y into the chat if you've ever felt yourself doing that. How many Ys are we going to have coming into the chat? Yeah, we blame. Now, why do we do this? Why do we do it? Well, it kind of makes us feel better. Might be one reason. If it's him, then it means it's not me. if it's them, we can stand here and feel righteously that we're doing everything fine because it's them, not us. And I do jest because actually I think a little bit of humour and lightheartedness in a session like this can be helpful, because this is really quite serious and can be very heavy. And so look at all these whys. And of course, as human beings, this is what we do. And it's starting to recognise in yourself and in myself, because this starts here. It starts here. Changing the culture begins here with me. And the first thing is to notice that I do this. And of course, there are all sorts of reasons why I do it. However, most of those reasons are to protect myself from the discomfort of the possibility that, you know what, I might have contributed to this problem, or I might not be quite as wonderful at giving good feedback as I thought I was, or whatever it is. And thank you, is it Jan or Jan in the chat there? It's not just about blaming other people. It might well be that self-critical self-blaming as well. There's that then is going on inside. And you know what? Something I heard really, really recently, and I've not shared this with Georgia, I don't think, is I was reading some stuff about narcissism, as you do, bedtime reading. And it talked about when you judge or blame somebody, you're pointing one finger that way, but you're actually pointing 3 fingers back at yourself a lot of the time. Because I might well be saying to you, it's you didn't listen to me, and that's the problem. But I'm doing that while I'm over talking you and interrupting you and actually not listening to you either. And so you know deep down that you're actually probably doing this as much as anyone else, but that's really uncomfortable. So it's easier to attribute it to somebody else. Any of this making sense? Just give me a bit of a verbal indication. Yeah, please do feel free if you're lost at any point, because I have a tendency to sort of dart around a little bit. Okay, and yes, we are acknowledging in the chat that this is human, and when we don't want to accept criticism, when maybe it's really uncomfortable to think, do you know what? I might be part of the problem here. And I was really struck by many of the comments in the Menti early on, but there was a particular comment that stood out for me in this respect. And somebody said something about gossiping. Somebody said something about being drawn in to gossiping about colleagues. And of course, our organisations run. There's a whole shadow system of reality that is basically gossip. And some of that, it helps get things done because it's about who knows what, and, you know, it's intelligence. And also there's a really potentially toxic element of it, isn't there? And I was describing an example just this week. Well, Dill, thank you for being so honest in the chat there. Why do we love it so much? Well, it is part of the blame, because actually if we can talk about other people and all the things that they're doing wrong or that we don't like or what happened, it means that we can kind of maybe move away from the discomfort of what's going on for us. All sorts of other stuff going on around the reasons for gossiping. But I work with a particular NHS trust, and I've coached their exec team for quite a few years. And they had a new chief exec come in 2 or 3 years ago now, and she absolutely holds the position of she never speaks badly of a colleague ever if they're not in the room. Now, just let that sink in. She will give direct feedback that may be uncomfortable if that person is there to own it and to be able to have a conversation about it. But she absolutely models a no gossip approach. And it's not just that, but that, amongst many other things, has transformed how safe people feel. And that has transformed into their staff survey, into their quality of care, into all sorts of positive impacts. Why? Because people can stop worrying that all of those conversations are happening about them without them. And it feels more honest, and it actually is much more compassionate. Now, that is such a high standard, I think, to hold yourself to as a human being, because it's so tempting to fall into the blaming. And I just admire it so much. And I don't think she would even pretend that she's perfect on this, but it's just something that matters so much to her. And so when I hear people saying the culture is X, the culture is Y, I do often find myself being curious around, well, how much are we being the change we want to see? So if we want a culture where people are not terrified of other people's judgments, the starting point is to stop judging other people so negatively and particularly blaming them. And that lies with me. And this is really tricky stuff, because that might mean that I don't partake in conversations in the office, or that I stay quiet when people are trying to tempt me into discussions that I don't want to be involved in, and so on. So a lot to talk about around blame, but B is blame. What then is D? D, distract. Let's move on. Anybody heard that in the last month? Let's take this offline. Let's not have this conversation at this point in time. It's not appropriate to be discussing this in this forum. I mean, we could go on. We could give all sorts of examples of distract. Now, of course, sometimes why we distract is we haven't actually got the time to have a meaningful conversation right now. However, in my work of over 30 years now, consulting with organisations, teams, very often in health and social care, distract is a classic strategy used to avoid the discomfort of something that we really don't want to acknowledge. I don't know whether any of you would agree with that. And if we do not acknowledge uncomfortable stuff, it makes the uncomfortable stuff undiscussable. And that erodes psychological safety, and it means that people are worried about what they say. It means that the rhetoric of all the value statements and so on and so forth, they remain rhetoric, and they don't get translated into reality. And that leads to a sense of, this is disingenuous, this is just words. Actually, when there's something really hard, the conversations aren't happening. And I could give you lots and lots of examples of where I see this and how I see this manifesting itself. And when I see it, what I notice there is this is a human response to discomfort. This is not somebody going out to be dishonest. It is a sign that this person, maybe who's facilitating a conversation or who's had something raised that really feels tricky, their response to the discomfort is, we're going to distract away from it. And I think it might be useful just to reflect on whether you notice that in any of your dynamics, and that indeed you may do it yourself. You know, at a personal level, and I'm just going to take the slide down because you've probably written down your BDSP, and I'll come back to it in a minute, but we don't really need BDSP up forever. Is that, you know, busy. I'm busy. I've got a diary planned for the next 6 months. Busy. And that's the way some people thrive. And it can be a really effective strategy for not really spending time thinking and paying attention to something that I really don't want to think about. And this gets amplified in organisational life as there is actually a real need to be busy. But being so busy is viewed as a virtue. And yet it can mean that we are avoiding and distracting away from stuff that we really need to pay attention to. So that's another classic response. Ruby, this feels like blame equals fight. Yes, and it's really interesting to pull the threads back to Georgia's connect and the river metaphor. And yeah, I don't know if Georgia, if you want to add to that, but all of this work is kind of rooted in the same theoretical base. So the BDSP it's all that is my kind of way of describing work that was done back in the 60s and 70s by Virginia Satir, who was a family therapist. And these are human responses, you know, in family and group settings as well. And she doesn't articulate them quite like this, but they're ways of human beings trying to survive when everything feels too much. And each of us responds in these ways, and we'll come on to S&P in a minute, in different levels. We all kind of have a tendency to gravitate maybe more to one or the other as it's like, I think about it as stabilizers on a bike. I'm going to keep my stabilizers on, and blame might be my key stabilizer, or distract might be mine, but it means that I feel a bit safer in what otherwise would be far too threatening. So what is the S? Well, S is another very typical response to discomfort, and it is solve. Let's get a grip. Let's get this sorted. We just need to sort this out. Let's get control of this. Let's get our hands on it and fix it. Now, we need people who can fix things. Of course we do. This isn't about saying it's all bad. And solve it mode, as I call it, is a default mode for many of us, and actually for many of the ways that we get our work done. And, you know, vast majority of you may be in the jobs that you're in because actually you like making things better. You like sorting things out. It gives you a real sense of value and purpose and potency if you can solve a problem. Put an S into the chat if you relate at all to liking to fix things and liking to get your hands on things. Is this any part of your repertoire of what helps you feel valuable in the world? We've got lots of S's. So why can this potentially be a problem? Well, it's like everything. It sometimes horses for courses, and in many situations, it's exactly what we need. And you know what? The wheels would fall off if we didn't have people who are good at sorting things out and solving them. The problem possibly comes then when we're dealing with something that isn't solvable. And, you know, I'd be interested in George's perspective of whether trauma is something you can solve. And yeah, go.
I mean, not in a meeting. Not in a work setting, probably.
And do you know what I've been really fascinated about in my, you know, in the last few years that I've been researching this and writing about it and working with organisations on it is something I learned from a specialist in disordered eating, a specialist consultant nurse practitioner, who shared with me that they were changing their fundamental approach to supporting people with disordered eating, from looking at the people as being fragile to considering the people they were supporting there as resourceful. Because if I see you as fragile as a colleague, or if I as a manager see a team member as fragile or in need of help or in need of support, it's almost suggesting I need to fix that. I need to change you so that you are no longer fragile. And it leads to an inference that actually I have the right to sort you out. Now, raise your hand if you want somebody to sort you out. Does any human being really want to be sorted out by another human being? To be fixed? I don't really want to be fixed. I'm fine, thanks. I've got a few issues, but, you know, and it's a human response. Oh, Catherine's coming. Kath's coming with, yes. And that's a whole other debate, that the whole premise of the medical model is we've got a human being here. There's a bit of them that's got a problem and we're going to fix it. And of course, it's more complex than that. But it's about control. And so going back to why is this a human response, it's because actually if I feel I can sort this out or solve it, it gives me my sense of control that I need to self-protect against the possibility that I might be out of control. So you might find in your life yourself putting in your stabilizers when things are feeling rather overwhelming, or when you're feeling under threat or pressure, and you might have a tendency to try and control things. And it shows up in organizations as micromanagement, as mega reporting on everything. It shows up as not trusting people to get on with the job. It shows up as us taking everything onto ourselves because actually no one else will do a decent job. It shows up in all sorts of ways, all of which are essentially fundamentally human responses to trying to feel control when we might not have any. So this is why it can be problematic, as well as being a useful skill set to have. And so what is the P? Well, the P stands for placate. Another way of saying pleasing people. Making it'll be fine. It's fine. It's not as bad as it seems. Let's look on the bright side. It'll get better. Things are improving. You're strong, you'll cope. I mean, I'm not wanting to sort of say that none of these things are ever appropriate, and they are. The thing is, they are absolutely generally well meant. They're well intended, because placating has a desire behind it to make things better for somebody. Would you agree? I want to try and make this less bad for you. And of course, that's in some ways a kind, generous, considerate thing to offer. So what is the problem with it? Well, the problem with it is that it can overlook how somebody is really feeling. It can feel like glossing over something that is really serious. It can therefore feel disingenuous. It can feel lacking in empathy. It can completely bypass empathy. And it can erode trust. Because if I'm feeling something and you are responding to me in a way that I don't feel my true feelings are being acknowledged, because maybe they're too uncomfortable, that leaves me feeling alone, disregarded, and that doesn't help me trust you. So I see placate an awful lot in teams going on, and it can be really counterproductive, even though it's very well intended. And the reason, why do we placate other people? Well, it's actually to do with our own sense of, I don't really want to feel or be alongside this pain or suffering that I'm hearing or witnessing. And this is about primarily me making myself feel better. So there's some quite tricky stuff there that I've said, and it's difficult to talk in generalizations. All I want to do is to help you take a lens on this, which is, you know what, if you start looking in your environment, in your interactions, in the way you respond to colleagues, to things that happen at work, with BDSP in your head, you will see it everywhere, in yourself and in others, because that's what humans do. So once we see it, once we acknowledge it and recognize it, how does that help? Well, it helps in the sense of being able to say, do you know what? These might be familiar, predictable patterns. They're not, though, inevitable. I have a choice. I have some agency. If I can start to recognize my BDSP tendencies being driven to self-protect, I do have a chink of opportunity to respond differently from that. And this is where the opportunity for culture change lies, in my view. So what would this look like? So the alternative then, or what I call the antidotes to these, are not BDSP, they're CARE. So you might want to write this down. The antidote to blame, it's him, it's her, it's them, it's curiosity. What might be happening here Why is this person behaving that way? What is it that has led this person to do that? How could I make sense of this behaviour? What is it I possibly don't know? What are my blind spots? What might be going on that I've got no sight of? What is invisible to me here that is resulting in this behaviour? What I see so often in teams, particularly when I'm asked to come in and mediate or facilitate and help with a breakdown of trust in teams, is focusing on what I call the symptoms. That behaviour has to be dealt with. We need to manage that. We need that to stop. It's all about the symptoms. And what we're doing with curiosity is getting beyond the symptoms of how somebody is behaving or how a group is behaving to what might be going on leading to that behaviour. Now, this isn't about excusing behaviour that is not okay. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, before we start deciding who's to blame and whose behaviour needs to change, and that's completely unacceptable and that's outrageous and how dare she, so on and so forth. Ever heard of any of that? Before we go there is, okay, let's just understand this as a human group of people responding to pressure in the way humans do, and there will potentially be some blaming going on. So why are people feeling the need to blame each other? Teresa says, have we covered P? Yeah, P is placate, pleasing others. So Claire is saying, this is why I'm here. I found recently supporting staff noticing their behaviour. Absolutely. And you might be noticing some of what you could say is BDS or P, or a mixture of that. So curiosity is a great place to start when you notice yourself falling into blame. And I'm going to say something quite tricky now. And I know it's tricky because I do this work with a lot of people, and I know when things are received in a way that feels, ooh. There were quite a few comments in the Menti earlier on about the management, about leaders who do this, management who are doing that. And what I would invite you to do is to just reframe that and see if it, from a curious point of view, sheds any light on this, as in terms of curiosity. Why would a senior person behave that way? Bearing in mind that senior person is under massive sense of threat. That's the reality. They are immensely under pressure and threat, as much as anybody else. Different, not better, not worse, not more or less. It is different. But relating to people who are more hierarchically senior to you as human beings, rather than as the management, first of all, humanises our interactions. Second of all, it brings a sense of being equal as humans, regardless of where we are in the triangle. Because the triangle, the hierarchy is real, but it's not the only reality. It's just something that we've kind of concocted to make sense of what would otherwise be chaotic. Every person, however senior or however newly qualified they are, is a human being, and when they behave in a certain way, that there's a reason for that. And if you find yourself blaming the management, that is part of the dynamic as well. Because the management, they're human beings, and yes, they have a degree of accountability that might be more than yours. However, seeing their behaviour through the lens of what's going on for them, what would help me understand the pressures they're under, that would help me understand why they're micromanaging, why they are being so verbally aggressive, etc., etc. Now, it is important that we have boundaries as well, and we'll come on to boundaries around what isn't acceptable behaviour. But actually, another really quite tricky thing to think about is the people we talk about as bullies in organisational life. Essentially, they are human beings who are not at all coping with the pressure, and they may not at all be coping with who they are as themselves. And bullying is an extreme of blame. It's basically a massive external manifestation. A lot of bullies are blaming themselves, but they can't, so they blame everybody else, and so on. So this is complex, and we've not got time to get into all of the sophisticated dimensions of it. But I'm just offering those two perspectives, which I hope might just help to illuminate what can often get sort of wrapped up as an us and them between management, and you may be management in other people's eyes, and others who aren't management, and then we're setting ourselves up as us and them, and is that what we really want? Okay, so B, the antidote to blame, curiosity. D, the antidote to distract. Well, attention, beginning with A. It's attention, that hugely valuable, loving resource that you can, commodity you can offer to somebody. Attention. And the really interesting thing here is that obviously if we're distracting our attention away from something, the antidote to that is, well, I'm going to pay attention to something. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to ask about it. I'm going to listen with my full undivided attention, even just for a minute. That is so precious. Something that we can offer to people. Now, we're not talking about sitting down and having half an hour one-to-one with everybody we work with every week. It's completely unrealistic to think about that. But a minute or two of absolute, and Michael West talks about this around listening with fascination. It is a gift you can give people, even if it is just to acknowledge how they are or what they're saying, without then dealing with how they know. It's attention. It is just this beautiful thing as human beings that we crave it. And if we don't get it, we probably behave in a way that tries to demand it. So paying attention in the literature around compassion is almost the essence of where compassion begins. And this is where, if you find yourself or notice yourself distracting away from a conversation or taking something out of a group to have a one-to-one because it's going to be too embarrassing, or we don't want to seem unprofessional, or all of the reasons we distract, actually, how could we have conversations where we're paying attention to stuff that really matters to people, even if it's uncomfortable? S, solve. What's the antidote to solve? Well, I think the real revelation for me with this was this colleague I mentioned around moving away from seeing people as fragile in a clinical setting to seeing people as resourceful. So the antidote to S is R, releasing resourcefulness. Wow. What would that look like if our leadership contribution was not to solve and to control, but was to release the resourcefulness of people? Trust people that actually they do know a huge amount. They know they can offer, they have huge amounts to offer, and we don't need to be constantly managing them, tightly controlling them, which is limiting. And this is the core to innovation. It's the core to, you honestly, you never know what is possible in your teams until you've really, really experimented with releasing the resourcefulness of the team. And I know this sounds, you know, you might be thinking, Jeanne, it's all very well for you to sit there, but you don't know what it's like in our team with our manager. I know, I do actually, I absolutely do know, because although that's not my environment anymore, I lived with that and experienced that for many years. And I work with people who are finding their way through shifting their leadership in this way every day of the week. And so this is for you to just open your mind to, what would this look like if I tried to solve less and release resourcefulness more? Now, this is scary because it means letting go of control. It means taking the stabilizers off my bike. And you know what? I might cock up. You know, the tech might not work. If I ask, you know, if I admit that I'm not sure, or that I need some help, or I need ideas, or I've made a mistake, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? What are people going to think? And this is all around why we end up not feeling psychologically safe. So just have a think, what would it mean in your context to just take a mini experiment away from solve, fix it. We must be improving everything. What are our outcomes? How are we measuring it? To, what about releasing resourcefulness? Okay, and P, what is the antidote to placate? It's E, and it's empathy. And this is about essentially stop trying to make people feel things that they don't feel. Stop trying to make people feel better. Because it's nobody's right for anyone to tell me how I should or shouldn't feel. Georgia talks quite a bit in other work that we do around just the natural human condition of feeling sad, of feeling frustrated, of feeling negative things. It's a natural human way of coping with life, is to feel. And you know, team leaders sometimes say to me, I just want my team to be happy. And, you know, if I've got a relationship with those team leaders, or those, you know, sometimes, you know, people in the hierarchy very senior, I just want colleagues who are happy. You know, why is it your job to tell people what they should or shouldn't feel? And if people don't feel happy, how would that sound, that you want me to be happy? That's a control mechanism. It's trying to control somebody's feelings, which is about my needs rather than yours. This is not easy, and I don't expect people to necessarily agree with me. It's a perspective, though, that can unlock a real insight into how we can empathize, which is being alongside someone with whatever they are feeling, helping them feel less alone with what they are genuinely feeling, and actually possibly not doing very much at all some of the time, but being. And of course, I don't need to teach you all about empathy. It's something you use all the time. And yet in our quest to try to make things better for people with the best of intentions, we can inadvertently bypass empathy. Okay, so this is just a really simple way of thinking about our human responses, and it's interesting to consider how it relates to trauma. So we've got blame, distract, solve and placate, and moving into curiosity, attention, resourcefulness, and empathy. So how does this in any way underpin our work around culture and leadership? Well, it's relevant in the sense that if we're trying to take a trauma-informed approach, we're trying to take an approach which is informed about how human beings respond to that sense of overwhelming helplessness, which is the ultimate threat to our humanness. And so it's really useful to just be aware of the repertoire of behaviour that we can see when somebody is feeling under threat and needing to self-protect. And of course, you've mentioned, some of you in the chat and in the Mentee psychological safety, and that's the kind of leadership phrasing, isn't it, that has become so topical. And so it's interesting to think about what this actually feels like. What does it feel like when you are unsafe in your relationships at work? I will give you an example of that in a minute, of the resourcefulness, yes. And these images by my colleague Julian Burton really help us to get beyond the sort of the kind of academic intellectualizing of psychological safety into what it feels like. So I imagine that you've all been in relationships at some point, or conversations or meetings or team dynamics where it's felt a bit like this on the left. And I hope that you've also been part of conversations that feel like this on the right, and you know how different it feels. It's hard to put it into words, but you know how different it feels. Now, Imagine that the issue being discussed in these two images is actually a really tricky issue or a really uncomfortable issue. Because it's easy to have a conversation on the right when the topic is uncontroversial, it's fairly comfortable, it's fine. However, what would it be like if we could have uncomfortable conversations, and that might include stuff to do with trauma, amongst lots of other things, in a way that feels like that? Is that even possible as human beings? Well, it is possible. It's just not terribly custom and practice. It's not our norm. It's what I aspire to. And this is about sort of acknowledging that, yes, we know that psychological safety in sort of, you know, technical terms, it means being able to speak up. It means trusting and respecting each other, to be candid. It means being able to sort of have conversations that would otherwise be tricky in a way that doesn't leave us bruised or terrified or, you know, shaking in our boots or needing to go to the toilet and hide in a cubicle for 5 minutes after we've had a conversation, which is actually people's lived reality some of the time. But at the heart of some of this is it's about taking interpersonal risks together. And when we're talking about people who are experiencing trauma, it is risky to acknowledge that, to admit that, to ask about that. It's risky territory. Why? Because it's focusing on us moving away from being strong and professional and all of those labels and knowing what to do all the time and being competent. Because actually we don't like being judged by other human beings as those sorts of things. You know, if I'd have welcomed you all to the session and said, I'm working with Georgia and I'm Jeanne and I don't really know what I'm talking about and I'm not really sure what I'm doing. And actually I'm a bit of a pain in the neck when it comes to asking awkward questions. And, you know, I'm really not on top form today. I'm a bit of a mess. We're going to do some great work with me. But you know what? All of that is true some of the time. And I'm also amazing at things. I'm really, really good at a lot of stuff. And people value me. And I've got skills. I've got 30 years of wisdom and experience. And the two things sit together. But I don't want to be judged by all those as all of these things. And so what we see in our teams and our cultures is people behaving in ways to protect themselves. And it's again BDSP, being driven to self-protect against the fact that you might possibly think badly of me. So I don't ask questions. I don't admit mistakes. I don't speak up. I don't disagree, particularly with people that I think are more knowledgeable, powerful, influential than I am. Whether they are or not is a completely different matter, because a lot of that is all an illusion anyway. And I don't ask for help. And therefore, we have teams who are behaving in these green ways. And then you overlay that with the fact that people in this team might be traumatized as well. They're even more likely to self-protect. And we end up having teams where clinical care is unsafe. That's why this matters, because teams that behave in those green ways are not safe clinically. They're also not likely to have healthy well-being within them, higher levels of stress. They're more likely to have people leaving. They're less likely to be able to attract people or keep people. And actually, teams and organisations where we've got a lot of green behaviours on indicators even around bottom line performance perform a lot less well. So this isn't nice to have stuff. This is not just icing on the cake if we get round to it. This is safety critical, it's quality critical, and it is business critical. And so what is our role in any of this as leaders then? Well, one of the things to think about is that actually I would like, not that I feel I have the right to tell people how to feel, but I would like to try and create an environment where even with difficult issues to deal with, we feel safe to ask questions, raise issues, talk about tricky things without the sense of negative judgment that can go with that. And it does raise the question of what would it be in my practice on a Monday morning or a Thursday afternoon? What could I do differently when I notice myself in BDSP being driven to self-protect from the discomfort, moving more into curiosity, attention, resourcefulness, and empathy? So I'm just going to pause momentarily because I can see there's some things in the chat, and I just want to pick those up. I'm aware of time, and we have got, oh, we've got a survey hero coming in. Yeah, so that's great from Manal. Thank you very much there for that, around just getting some feedback. So just picking up, Dill, your point around resourcefulness. This is the shift from solve to being resourceful. I think the examples I would give here is moving out of that space as a manager or as a colleague where you're trying to be in the middle of sorting something out for somebody, and maybe moving into a role where you are more coaching somebody to find their own answers, coaching someone to believe that they actually have the capacity to solve their own problem. Now, what I'm not talking about here, absolutely not talking about that mantra of don't bring me problems, only bring me solutions. Not that. Because that actually is a distraction. That's a distraction from the discomfort that actually somebody's not got any solutions and I don't have any either. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Let's just distract away from it by saying, just go and get me some solutions. I don't mean that. I mean leader as coach rather than leader as controller. I don't know if that helps. In a nutshell, that's what I'm talking about. Dill, is there anything you'd like to just explore any further on that, sort of verbally at this point? Because I want to sort of feel that I've responded adequately to what was behind your inquiry there. Oh, you've put thank you in the chat. Anything?
Very happy with that. Thank you so much. Okay.
Having permission culture, see the video, turn the ship around. Oh, there's a nice little resource there that Suzanne is pointing us to in the chat. That's something I'm definitely going to go and have a look at. And a permissions culture, you know, that we can call it different things. And actually, I think this comes to my own permission to have some agency and choice, and the choice to use my power. Because I think everyone has power. We don't all have the same power, particularly in structural terms. However, we do all have power to some extent. And yet, organisational life can suck that belief out of us. And some of this is helping you connect back with the power you have. Now, when I say power, I don't mean dominating other people. I'm not talking about dominatory power, because that basically is BDSP stuff. What I'm talking about is what I call liberatory power or emancipating power. It's using my power to help liberate other people to use theirs. Does this sound like a revolution? I don't mean it to sound like let's have a revolution. However, I am absolutely suggesting that we can't go on the way we are with the leadership approaches, which is grounded in trying to control everything and everyone. It's just unsustainable. It's making people ill. It's getting us really bad outcomes in our public services. It is absolutely avoiding us having accountability. It is leading to all of the scandals, in inverted commas, around corruption, around illegal practice going on in plain sight. It's all grounded in this approach to leadership, which is a veneer of trying to pretend we're in control, when frankly, we're not. All of these are personal views. Feel free to disagree. So just turning back then to what am I actually sharing at the moment? Are you still seeing the slide at the moment, Georgia? Yeah. Okay, so just moving back to the slide then. We did say in the session outline that we'd be just exploring psychological safety specifically, and I know I keep veering a bit off, but we are still talking about that. And just a couple of myth busters here, because I do sometimes hear people talking about, oh, psychological safety, you know, it's just about being nice to everybody. Oh, it's all about being polite. And it's absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. This is about having conversations that can really feel uncomfortable in a way, more often, in a way that feels less threatening. So it enables, the more psychologically safe we are, the more we can say things that are difficult to say and hear. Because we're not going to fly into BDSP in response to each other. We're going to hold each other in a space of CARE, which enables us to lower our defenses. And that's at the heart of creating psychological safety. It's lowering our defenses to defend our own ego and to defend ourselves against the threat of other people. Now, it is not easy work. This is hugely courageous. The fact that you're here learning about it and really leaning into this discomfort is modeling. And just so thank you so much for being here, because you are the culture change. It's also not about lowering performance standards. It's not about saying, oh, everybody could get away with anything then, you know, because actually, you know, anybody can say anything, and if we're psychologically safe, that's fine. No, it's about actually holding very clear expectations with each other and be able to discuss when those aren't upheld, but not in a way that is pointing the finger, blaming, turning attention away, distracting away from something. That's not trying to sort people out, solve people who are problems, and it's not trying to make everything better. It's leaning into curiosity, attention, resourcefulness, and empathy. Okay, so I will just pay my attention back to the chat shortly, and I'm not going to go through all of these points now in detail because you'll get them on the slides, and I'm just conscious of time. But these are just some sort of just quick things to think about, which we'll share in the slides with you, around how practically you can start considering how to have safer conversations. And one of the really useful, well, I find it useful, you might not find it useful, is actually in the words you use. What you say really matters, because the way you respond to something when somebody raises something that might feel uncomfortable absolutely sets the tone for whether it is safe to continue. And these are 8 core things that absolutely build psychological safety. And again, we won't sort of spend lots of time going into them all. They kind of speak for themselves. But what I would encourage you to do is to think, what would this sound like coming out of my mouth? Because I need my own words for this. What would it sound like for you to, sometime this week or next, to do or say something like this that you don't normally do or say? Try it out. Just say something a bit different. Just contribute or respond in a team or a group or to a colleague in one of these ways and see what happens. Do a little mini experiment and, you know, see what happens. Hands up just in the chat, or yes into the chat. Why into the chat? If you've heard in the last week at work anybody say, it'd be great to hear who disagrees about this. Let's bring on the dissent. Let's have a conversation now about all the ways we disagree with what's just been said. Just put into the chat a why if you've heard that in any of your work. And if you have, let's celebrate that, because I don't hear it very often. And it would be great to hear some examples of how that potentially opens things up. I don't think I've ever heard it, says Rachel. It's uncomfortable if we have different perspectives, and yet, you know what? We do have different perspectives, whether we name the fact that we do or not. So let's have a conversation about it, because I might learn something from you. You might learn something from me. And But often we're in such a rush to get consensus because we think consensus is good, because then we can take action because we've got consensus, because everyone agrees. And if nobody's expressing a view, oh, we'll take silence as consensus, that's fine. You know, and yet actually consensus can be really problematic as well. So yeah, some potentially provocative things here. And this does take us fundamentally to compassionate leadership. And I know that some of you have been on a previous masterclass on this, so I do not want in any way to suggest that there's anything better here around compassionate leadership than what you've learned previously. I just think sometimes it can be useful to have a simple way of remembering, because it's quite complex. And I just find CARES to sum it up for me. Curiosity, attention, resourcefulness, empathy, and self-compassion. Those are the core elements of compassionate leadership. They're the core elements of a trauma-informed leadership approach. They're the core elements of human-centered leadership. And this is not just according to Jeanne Hardacre. This is, although I'm not giving you loads of references, there are references and a reading list on the slides. This is grounded in years of research, reading, being immersed in this work, and a PhD that I've done as well. So I'm not just making this up. It's sort of come from a whole wide range of wisdom that I've gathered and garnered along the way, including that from Georgia. So let's just very briefly then, and we have got time for this, if we're going to do the evaluation through the chat, the link in the chat rather than in the real session. I just do want, though, to pay attention to something that I think sometimes gets we distracted from in our conversations around compassionate leadership. Because do you know what? Sometimes I don't feel compassionate. What then? What if I find it and I'm struggling to feel any compassion at all for you or for them, or about even maybe for my patient, for the person I'm here to serve? This is a reality, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that compassion can feel really difficult. If somebody's behaving in a way that is leaving me feeling a really awful set of feelings at the end of my working day, it is so hard to feel compassion for them. I just want to blame them. I just want to attack them. I want to get revenge. You know, that's because I've been driven to self-protect. So it's all very well talking about CARE, but you know what? It is not easy. It is not easy. And this is where I think the notion of fierce compassion can be really helpful. And it's from the literature. And it's about taking a view that, do you know what? Sometimes the most unkind thing I can do is to turn a blind eye or do nothing or accept something that frankly is not okay. There's no compassion in that, because by doing that, I'm perpetuating and colluding with something that's harmful. And this is where we get toxic cultures from. This is where we get cover-up cultures from, because of what I call the zebra effect. Well, I'm not going to go into the zebra effect here and now, but it's about the fear of standing out. It's about blending in because I don't want the discomfort of being different. But fierce compassion means actually standing up for what you believe, doing what is right rather than doing the right thing, because they're not always the same, unfortunately. Doing things right according to the book, according to process, even according to the justice system. I mean, the post office of absolute disaster is showing us that even going through the formal legal justice system, which is doing the right thing, was not the right thing to do. And this is why this matters so much, because if we only ever rely on organizational mechanisms, institutional mechanisms for getting things done, that leads to corrosive politics, to, you know, things that go on forever unchallenged, suffering, distress. It leads to people needing to blow the whistle. and the devastating consequences of that. And I speak from personal experience in that regard. And these scenarios, they all need what we call fierce compassion. So this might not feel a kind of conversation to be having, because I might be having to say some things that aren't nice to hear or say. The reason I'm saying them is not through blame and wanting to vent and attack you. It's because this matters to us addressing and dealing with our purpose, pursuing our purpose, which is quality care, it's quality services, it's equity, it's all of the things that we come to work for. And it links to Brené Brown's work on boundaries. And we come back to our river metaphor. And so I'm just going to finish here, because we do want to offer you a tool before you go away that George is going to take us through. But leading with compassion has boundaries at its heart. And that feels like a bit of a misnomer, because often people feel that having boundaries is a selfish thing to do, because it involves potentially saying no. And particularly people who tend to placate, who like to please others and seek other people's approval a lot, find it very hard to hold boundaries, because they see it as being selfish. And it's the opposite. It is a generous thing to do. Why? Because it avoids us falling into feeling resentful to other people. Because if my boundaries are being breached, if I'm being taken for granted, so on and so forth, it's very hard for me to feel compassionate to you. I feel resentful and bitter, and that shows up. And so we run separate work on boundaries, healthy boundaries. Georgia and I do quite a lot of work on this. But this is just to give you a heads up on it here, and why boundaries matter. So on that note, what we're going to do is just now to pick up the S in CARES, which is self-compassion. Because actually some of the blaming, as you've identified, can be in our own heads on ourselves, and offering a gentle self-compassion, turning the light of curiosity, attention, resourcefulness and empathy to ourselves is core to self-compassion. So Georgia's going to take you through a tool that we offer you now that you can take away and use for yourself and colleagues.
So I'm just going to skim through this very, very quickly to hand over to Dianne, who's going to sum up for us. So you'll have access to this tool to look at in your own time, but it's just pulling together a bit of what we've learned about the individual work that we can do, and then the work we can do as a team. So the first section is just asking you to tune in to different cues from your body, thinking about that physiological, psychological relationship that tells you you're under stress, that your river's getting full, that your banks might be being pushed or eroded a little bit, and think of these as a communication rather than something to be afraid of. Okay, so noticing physical, there's lots of prompts here, so you'll be able to look at this in your own time and think about for you individually. Have a reflect about what you've learned about yourself in recent years. So who are you? Who are you at work? What helps you? What matters to you? Where are your values? So connect to yourself. Have a think about looking forward, preparing. So we know if we have awareness of things that are coming, we're in a little bit of a better state to have that sense of autonomy. So just thinking about not necessarily specifics, but like challenges that might come up, winter pressures, summer pressures, changes to services. And then have a think, this is the OT part coming in, the occupational therapy, things you want to do a bit less. So clearing that, I use gardening metaphors a lot, clearing the bed, ready for things you might want to do more. So as an OT as well, I always like to say, you know, if we want to stay well, we need to prescribe ourselves enjoyment 3 times a week. If a physio program needs 3 times a week of going through that program to have effect, as the evidence shows, to keep ourselves well, we also need to be prescribing enjoyment to help ourselves get into connect, to understand what we like doing, to build those banks, to keep ourselves resilient and resourceful and in touch with our values and able to act on them. And then this is bringing in what Jeanne's been talking about, which is then what support of advice, reassurance, or even challenge do we want to ask for from the team around us, and perhaps from our personal life as well. So once we've connected to these things in ourselves, we've come from the internal out into what we know about ourselves, connected to ourselves. We've thought about our things that we're going to change around ourselves to help build those banks up and keep us more resilient. And then think about that team. It's interpersonal, it's always relational. what can we do with our social environment around us to help us stay steady? And in doing this, embedding these values for ourselves, we're in a much better position to role model those and carry those out and act those out for those around us. So this inner work feeds into supporting those around us as well. Hope that makes sense. That was a very concise, but I think actually no worse for it description than I ever give.